Welcome to this video where we essentially take the algorithm and implement that in pseudocode so we can then convert that pseudocode later to different programming languages. What I've done here is I've set up the problem statement. So we're going to assign a username, add up each of the ASCII values of each character in the username, find the mod. We're going to do mod 10 of the total. Now in terms of test plan, I have already pre-computed these values, and I know that if I put Mrs. Andrews CS in there, I should get a result of 0. And if I change that to Ms. Andrews, I should get a result of 6. So I'm going to use that as my test plan to compare to check if I have got this correct. So the first thing that we need to do is I'm going to use a function, and I'm going to call my function get seed. And we're going to add a parameter will be username. I'm just going to add my end function in now so that I don't forget. And then I'm going to just say seed is equal to get seed, and I'm going to put in Mrs. Andrews CS. Oops. And then I'm just going to print that seed, and of course right now it will give us a error because there is no code to run, and we can see that here. So what do we need to do first? Well, we need to assign a username. Well, we've done that. We need to add up each of the ASCII values. So if we're going to add them up, we need to total them. So the one thing we should do is we should create a total variable, and you can call that sum, total. It's just sometimes sum is a reserved word, so I prefer the word total. We're going to iterate through or loop through each item, and so we're going to need to know how many items are in the username. So we can do that by saying something like userlen is equal to username, and in OCR exam reference language we use the function length, or the property in this case length. So what do we do now? We want to loop around, so we know how to do a loop. We can say for, and we'll use I just for simplicity, is equal to 0, because we want to start from the 0th index, and then we want to go to username. No, my apologies, we want to go to userlen. But if we were to leave it as that, it would give us an error, because if we have a username that is of length 10, then we actually want to go from 0 to 9. So what we have to do here is put -1 in here, and I just like to put my next I in here so that it's all ready to go. So what do we need to do inside of here? Well, we need to total them up, each of the ASCII values. So first of all, we need to get the ASCII value. So let's just call that ASCII value. And how do we get the ASCII value? We do the command ASC, which we saw in one of the other videos. And the ASCII command is going to need the character. So we're going to say it's the username at the index of I. And so what will happen is that I will initially be 0, so ASC username I will give me the ASCII value of capital M. The next time around the loop I will be 1, so that will give me a ASCII value for the lowercase r, and this will repeat until we get to the end of our username. So then what can we do? Well, we need to add that to the total. So we can do ASCII value here, and that should then add them all up together, which is this part of the requirements. Then we need to get the mod of that, so we can say that the seed is equal to the total, and in OCR exam reference language we use capital MOD, mod, and we said we're going to do it via 10. And then of course we need to return that seed because this is a function. So that should be everything that is correct. Now of course we won't know until we run it, so we'll have a look see and we'll check. and we'll see that Mrs. Andrews CS, the seed is 0. So that seems to have worked. So now we can change this to Ms. Andrews CS, and hopefully we'll keep hoping that that returns a 6, which it does. So we've run our 2 test conditions and they have both passed. So what have we done? We've initialized a total. We've got the length of the username and we are iterating through that each item in the username. Well, actually we're iterating through a set of values, 0 to username length -1. We're taking the ASCII value of that particular character, and then we're adding that total to the running total, and then eventually we're taking the mod of that, which is this line here, and returning that value, and we've seen that it works. So that's how we can do this in pseudocode. So what I'm going to do, as I've done before, is I'm going to copy this pseudocode here, and we're going to go to the Python version. So let's have a look, and I'll just put that in here, and of course we're going to get a lot of squiggly red lines. So because this is in Python, I'll humour myself, and I'm going to use what we know as snake case. So before we were using camel case, we can see here camel case, and now I'm going to be using snake case. So I'm going to call that get seed, and as we know, we don't use the word function, we use the word def, and then we need our colon to demonstrate that we have a code block, and we want to do this just to delineate or show the end of the def. It's not a requirement, but I think it's a useful way to show where we are. Now this total equals 0, that's exactly the same way in Python. And how do we get the username length? Well, we switch that around and we use the len function. So rather than using a length property or attribute, we use the len function. Now, how do we convert this to Python? Well, remember we want to go for I in range, and this time we don't need to put userlen -1, because this automatically does not include the last number. That's how range works, if you remember from my previous video. Don't forget our colon for a code block. And how do we convert this? Well, in Python, the ASC function is simply ORD, and we index arrays or lists exactly the same way, and we can add these items exactly the same way. And I'm just going to comment that for good practice. And then we have seed equals total even. And how do we get mod in Python? Well, we use the %sign. We don't need to change anything here. Everything, we've got no squiggly lines. Don't forget that we are checking first. I'll go for Mrs. Andrews CS, and that should return us a seed value of 0. Let's just make this a little bit easier. The seed is and don't forget, in Python, if we want to concatenate, we have to convert it or cast it to a string. So let's see if this works. And we get the seed is 0. We're looking at Mrs. Andrews CS, which is correct. I change this now to Ms. Andrews and run this, we get the seed is 6. So this has passed the test. Now, if one looks at Edexcel programming language subsets, we'll note that, as I said in one of the other videos, that we don't need to use I in range, and we can actually simplify this code a little bit so that it is easier to read and understand. So what we can do is we can get rid of that userlen here, and rather than using I in range, we can say for I in username, and instead of I, it doesn't make sense anymore, it's not an index, it's the character, so I'm going to call that ch. So rather than having to take the index of username, I can now simply look at the actual character, because what this will do is the first time round ch will be capital M, second time round ch will be lowercase s in this particular case, and so on. So again, let's just to see if we have made any errors. It should give us a 6, which it does. And if I go to Mrs. Andrews and run this now, it should give us a 0. So now we've converted this pseudocode to Python, and I've showed you 2 different ways of making that code in Python. One using InRange to iterate through each index of the string, and one to actually take each character of the string and iterate through those. So now we'll move on to Visual Basic, but before we do that, we'll go back to this code here, and we'll copy that code, and we'll move on to Visual Basic. So I'm going to simply paste that in here, and this time I want to just move this code into our main function. And this of course is not going to work out the box, but this is our starting point. I'm just going to do some indentation, and this is where we are. So the first thing we're going to do is remember that in Visual Basic, where in order to initialize it, we have to tell it its type. So this is going to be an integer, and also in Visual Basic and C#, convention is to use what we call Pascal case, where we capitalize each word, including the first one, for functions. We still use camel case for variables, but for functions in Visual Basic and C#, the convention is to use Pascal case. So that's what I'm going to do here. Now, what else do we need to do? Well, we cannot use the word print or the function print. It's actually console dot write line, and we can do seed as we did before. And so let's now have a look at this program. Well, it is by val. We need to send that as a value. Again, this line of code is exactly the same, except we need to initialize it as an integer. This line of code is exactly the same, but we just need to initialize that as an integer. This line of code is almost identical. We're just using capital F and capital N here, and here we simply use a capital A only, the rest is lowercase, and this also works. Now here's a gotcha. In every other programming language that we're going to use, we would use square brackets, but Visual Basic decides it wants to be a pain, and we need to use round brackets for indexing in Visual Basic. This line of code is exactly the same in terms of the right side. We just, when we're initializing it, it needs to be initialized as an integer, and we can just do return seed exactly the same here, and then it is capital E with a space and then end space function. So with a bit of luck, we now have a working piece of code. So initially we're using, let's go back to and use Mrs. Andrews CS, which should give us a value of 0. Now Visual Studio Code does not play particularly well with Visual Basic, so I'm just going to run, first of all I'm going to need to change into the Visual Basic folder, and then I'm going to simply do .NET run, and hopefully that will run for us. And so we've got an error. So what is it? Says ASCII value is not declared. Of course, there we go. We need to declare that value, and it's going to be an integer. let's run that again. So .NET run. See what's going to happen when we run it, and we can see the value is 6. So let's go back and change that to Ms. Andrews, which we should know by now is going to be 6 for this one. Let's save that. Go to here, .NET run, and we should get 6. So now we've successfully converted this to Visual Basic. I'm just going to clear the console. There we go. And so now we have taken the pseudocode and we've converted it to Visual Basic. Once again, we're going to copy and paste this, and we are going to paste that into our program. And so what we need to do is just simply do that. Now, this particular version of .NET 7 means that we don't need to have the void main string, and this means also that we don't need to have the static either. So we can simply start from here. So let's fix this first bit. Well, we know that that needs to be an int, and we said that we're going to use Pascal case, and we need to do that here, and then console dot right line seed, and of course we're going to get lots of squiggly lines for the moment because the code above is not working. So let's start with this code. Well, first of all, as we said, let's change that. Now this is a function that's going to return an integer, so we can declare it as an integer, and this username is a string, so that will look like that. We'll just take this code here and we'll put that inside and get rid of this end function. Remember, we're using curly braces in C#. So again, like we did with the Visual Basic, we need to declare the type of our variable, and don't forget we need semicolons. Again, this is going to be an int, and just like we have in Visual Basic, this is a property, and of course we learned from the previous video this is not how to do a for loop in C#. What we can do is we can say for int I is going to be less than username, but because it's less than, that means we don't need the -1, and then we want to do I plus, and we're going to put those in curly braces, and we're going to take this code and pop it in here. Oops. And we don't need that next I. So let's not make the same mistake we did with the Visual Basic, and in C# we simply cast the character to a integer, because what this will do is it will take the item of the string, and each item of the string is a character, and so we need to cast that to an int, and then this line of code will of course be exactly the same. But if we're in C#, I'm just going to use this simpler method. Then of course we need to declare this as an int, and in C# mod is like it is in Python, which is mod 10. Don't forget our semicolon, and don't forget our semicolon here. We don't seem to have any red squiggly lines. Let's start again with Mrs. Andrews CS, and this should give us 0. In this case, I'm going to use the actual built-in run function, and hopefully it gives us 0, which it does. So I'll change that to Miss Andrews. Hopefully that will give us 6 when we run that as it is. Try that. And the answer is 6, or the result is 6. So that is working just fine. So now we've seen how to convert this to C#, but just like in Python, we can simplify that by removing this line of code here, and then using in Python, Python would use for in C# we use for each, and it's not an int, it's a char. In username, and just like we did with Python, we can then change that to ch, and of course we want this to be ch as the name of the variable. And so now what we can do is we've now simplified that code, so rather than iterating through and getting the item at each index, we can simply get each character in the username. Let's just run this one more. Hopefully we should get the answer of 6. Let's run that. And we can see the answer is 6. Let's change that back to Mrs. Andrews and hope that we get the answer of 0. And if we wait, we can see that we do in fact get the answer of 0. So what we've actually done is now converted this to we've implemented it in exam reference language or pseudocode. We've converted that to Python. We then converted the pseudocode from Python to the pseudocode to Visual Basic. We then converted the pseudocode. We then converted the pseudocode to C#. Now, because I'm lazy, this time we're going to add Java, but this time I'm going to simply copy this line of code here rather than going back to the initial code. And then I'm going to copy this code here into here. Now we do run into this exact same problem because this is a public static. Then I'm also going to make this a public static int. And here we go, and you start from here. Then get seed. It's not quite working yet, and if we don't use console.println in Java, we use system.out.println for print line. And what can we do now? So let's go back. Actually, what we wanted to do was to use the for loop, so we'll just start that. For int I is equal to 0, I is less than user name, user len. So we have to go back to here, and we have to say that int user len is equal to this time it's a function or a method on the string, so it's string username dot length. Now we can see that we've got a red squiggly line. That's because in Java it's a capital S for string, and here we can say I plus plus we have done before. So how do we fix this problem? Well, sadly we would like to be able to do username at index I. That'll be what we'd like to do, but that's not going to work, sadly. And why is that not going to work? Let's hover over here and see. It says the type of expression must be an array type, but it is resolved to a string. And so how can we get around that? Well, we could cast this to a character, or we could say username dot get char, username dot char at I, and so that will give us the character at index I. What is the problem that we have right now? What is it telling us? I cannot be resolved to a variable for int I equals 0, I is less than username. What is the problem right now? This in Java, a string is not iterable. Can you see it says it cannot iterate over an array or an instance of Java lang. So what we have to do is we say to char array, which converts or casts that, and it's not in, it is a colon here. We can comment this line out this time rather than copying and pasting, and there we have what seems to be something that we can try. So we should get a 6, which we do, and if we change that to Mrs. Andrews, we should get a 0 again, which we do. So we've seen how to do two slightly different methods in both Python, C#, and now in Java. So now we're going to move on to JavaScript, and again, because I'm lazy, I'm going to start with the C# code, but what I will do is I will go back to the for loop method, and I'll paste this code here. So now we're finally going to go to JavaScript. I'm going to put this code. Now remember that JavaScript is not typed, so I'm going to just change that to be function. And in JavaScript, the convention is camel case for both functions and variables, so I'll make that change here. And it is simply console lowercase dot log. So we're going to log that to the console. So let's go and work on this. So we don't need to type it. We don't need this and this in Python, but in JavaScript we can keep this code the same, except we don't use typing, but we do need to let it, because it's going to change. We need to make sure that we declare that. This is a constant, it's never going to change. This is a constant, so it's never going to change. And this is a slightly different way to do things, but we can say here we don't want it in, but it is a constant, it's not going to change. And we want to do dot to. Now let's have a look. I'm not ever sure how to do ASCII, so let's just go to here, say JavaScript convert char to ASCII. Hopefully how to convert, it will tell us here string.char code at index. Okay, so that's fine. We can go back to char code at I, and with a bit of luck that should work. So in here we can just use node c.js and we get an error automatically. So what is the error? And the reason is because we're not in the JavaScript folder. We'll try that again, and you'll notice that we get the value of 6. If we change that to Mrs. Andrews and run that again, we should get the value of 0. So what you'll see now is that we've converted this also to JavaScript. But again, just like in Python and C# and Java, we can also do this a slightly different way, and we can say something like username dot for each element, we want to take the jar code. What we want to do is say the elements. How do we get the element of it? We can say, well, we can take these two lines we did before and say the ASCII, no it's not, it's the elements dot char code at, and it's always going to be the 0th index. And let's see if that works. So we should be getting 0. What have we got? We've got an error. Username dot for each, and that's because username is not iterable in JavaScript. So how can we do that? Well, we can spread that into an array, just like we did in Java, for example, where we did do char array. And now if we try and run this again, we get 0. Change that to Ms. Andrews, we should get 6, which we do. So in this video, we have converted everything from, or we've initialized the code or written the code in pseudocode or exam reference language. We've converted that then to Python, Visual Basic, C#, Java, and JavaScript.